11 cents. That was all a mother in West Virginia needed to feed her husband and 4 children breakfast in 1953. Just a little stale bread, some flour, 1 egg, and the bacon grease saved in a coffee can beside the stove. Today, many people would pour that down the sink without a second thought. But in many poor Appalachian kitchens, it once kept an entire family full for one more morning before the men went down into the coal mines and the children headed to school. And number 4 on today's list was once considered poor people's food, to the point that many families were ashamed to even mention it until modern nutrition experts began calling it one of the healthiest traditional American breakfasts. Did your grandmother ever keep bacon grease in an old coffee can? These 25 breakfasts once kept coal mining towns, southern working families, and millions of Americans alive through the hardest years. Now, many of these dishes have almost completely disappeared from the modern kitchen. 11 cents. Today, that might not even be enough to buy a candy bar. But in the early 1950s, in many coal mining towns across West Virginia, that was once enough for a mother to prepare breakfast for an entire family before the sun had fully risen. And the most memorable part was never the poverty itself. It was the way those small kitchens still always had something hot placed on the table every morning. On the old wooden table, there were only a few slightly stale slices of bread, 1 egg, a little salt, and a bit of flour left at the bottom of a paper bag. To many people today, that would not look like a breakfast. But in kitchens like those, it was still enough to begin a new day. The mother reheated the bread in a cast-iron skillet so the inside would soften more. She beat 1 egg for a long time so it could be divided across many plates. The bacon grease left over from the day before was scraped out of an old coffee can sitting beside the stove, because nothing in that house was allowed to be wasted. Her husband was about to head down for his shift in the coal mine. Her 4 children were still sleepy upstairs. And that breakfast for the entire family may have cost only about 11 cents. The most memorable thing about those poor kitchens was never only the hardship. It was the quiet skill of women who knew how to keep their families going, even when money was almost gone. They did not need complicated recipes. They needed memory, patience, and hands skillful enough to turn very little into a meal that was still hot before the long day began. Today, many breakfasts come from cardboard boxes, plastic bags, or freezer compartments. But in that kitchen, breakfast came from the sound of hot grease sizzling on a cast-iron skillet, and from hands that understood the value of every smallest thing left in the house. In today's list, we will see a dish made from the cooking liquid of vegetables that many modern people pour straight down the sink. There will be poor gravy made from nothing but flour, grease, and water. There will be a dish made from leftover dough that made children stand beside the stove waiting every morning. And there will be breakfasts created from the very food left at the bottom of the pot. She did not cook from abundance. She cooked from memory, thrift, and love. If you enjoy stories about old kitchens, forgotten foods, and life in old America, follow the channel now. There are still many memories like these waiting to be opened again. If your family once had a poor meal like that, keep it in mind. By the end of the video, I want you to tell me about it. Before colorful cereal boxes appeared on American kitchen shelves, mornings in working-class families often began with the sound of a cast-iron skillet heating up in a still dark kitchen. The woman of the house opened a small cabinet where everything was carefully saved. A little bacon grease from the night before, a few slices of bread that had gone slightly hard, and 1 remaining egg were still enough to become breakfast for the entire family. Number 25 bread spread with bacon grease. The smell of hot bacon filled the small room before the sun had even risen. The mother used a knife to scrape the pale white grease from an old coffee can and heated it in a cast-iron skillet that had been used for many years. She spread the hot grease over slices of bread and sprinkled a little salt to deepen the rich flavor. In 1953, in a mining town in West Virginia, that breakfast may have cost only about 2 cents. For many families, it was what gave the father enough strength to begin his shift while the morning air was still bitterly cold and what kept the children full enough to walk to school. Today, people buy different cooking oils for different dishes. But in those working kitchens back then, 1 can of bacon grease was an entire family's reserve supply. Not even the smallest thing was wasted. Number 24 savory oatmeal with lard. The sound of a wooden spoon tapping the side of the pot echoed through a Kentucky kitchen in winter. The oatmeal slowly thickened in boiling water while steam fogged the old window glass. In 1951, a bowl of savory oatmeal with a little lard may have cost only about 4 cents in many rural households. The mother added a spoonful of fat and a little salt, not to make the meal luxurious, but to keep stomachs full longer during long, freezing workdays. Oatmeal was cheap, easy to cook, and could stretch across many difficult mornings. For farming families and manual laborers, a hot and filling bowl mattered far more than whether breakfast looked appealing. Number 23. Fried egg sandwich. Before sunrise, the first egg was already crackling in the hot grease on the cast-iron skillet. The mother flipped the egg quickly, then pressed 2 slices of bread onto the skillet, just long enough for the edges to become lightly crisp. In 1955, around the factory neighborhoods of Detroit, a homemade egg sandwich cost about 8 cents. She wrapped the sandwich in wax paper so the worker could carry it on the way to the machine shop. 1 egg could carry a morning. But after bacon, bread, and eggs, poor American kitchens still had an even more dependable ingredient: cornmeal. And if you think poor breakfasts were nothing but bland food, wait until the next section. Some dishes stayed in children's memories for the rest of their lives simply because of 1 slice of cold porridge fried again on a cast-iron skillet in the morning. Along the dirt road stretching through Appalachia and the rural South, cornmeal was once the thing that kept many families from going hungry. When there was not enough money to buy meat, when winters dragged on and work became scarce, a sack of cornmeal in the corner of the kitchen cabinet could become security for many mornings ahead. Number 22. Thick cornmeal porridge. In the corner of the old kitchen cabinet, the folded sack of cornmeal rested beside a wooden spoon darkened by years of use. During the winter of 1952, in a small Appalachian cabin, a bowl of thick cornmeal porridge may have cost only about 3 cents. The mother slowly poured the cornmeal into a pot of boiling water and stirred constantly so the porridge would not clump. Steam rose from the pot sitting on the wood stove while the mixture gradually thickened into a heavy breakfast that stayed warm in the stomach for a long time. In those freezing mountain regions, people did not eat breakfast for pleasure. They ate to have enough strength to go out to the fields, descend into the mines, or walk many miles through bitter cold weather. Number 21. Johnny cakes. Cold rain rattled against the tin roof while the small kitchen slowly filled with the smell of hot cornmeal. The mother mixed cornmeal with water and a little salt, then pressed portions of dough into flat cakes on the old wooden table. When the cast-iron skillet was hot enough, she placed each cake onto the surface and browned both sides until the edges became slightly crisp. In 1950, in rural Virginia, a few Johnny cakes may have cost only about 5 cents. Many women in those days did not need measuring cups or cookbooks. They knew whether the dough was wet enough by the feeling on their fingertips, and they knew exactly when the cake should be flipped simply by the change in the sound of the skillet. Number 20. Fried cornmeal mush with molasses. The children stood on their toes beside the stove, watching slices of cold cornmeal mush slowly turn golden brown in the hot grease. In many Tennessee farm kitchens in 1954, the leftover mush from the night before sometimes became the dish children looked forward to most the next morning. The mother let the mush cool overnight, then sliced it into thick pieces before frying it until the outside became crispy. While the food was still hot, she drizzled a slow stream of dark molasses across the golden surface. For the children gathered close to the stove, it felt like a small reward in the middle of a cold winter and days when there was not much to look forward to. But there were also mornings when even cornmeal was running low. When the kitchen cabinet was almost empty, the next dishes revealed just how skilled she truly was. There were mornings when the kitchen cabinet was almost empty. No meat, no vegetables, no money for groceries, only stale bread, leftover rice, and a little flour sitting at the bottom of a paper bag. In many working-class homes during the 1950s, that was when a grandmother's resourcefulness became most visible. She looked at what remained and quietly decided that breakfast would still appear on the table just like every other day. Number 19. Bread soaked in milk. The kitchen was so quiet that you could hear the old bread softening in the bowl of warm milk. The mother toasted the bread again to bring back some fragrance before placing it into a deep bowl and slowly warming the milk over low heat. In 1952, in an industrial town in Ohio, That meal may have cost only about 7 cents. Today, many people look at bread soaked in milk and see nothing more than a poor meal. But in many families back then, it was often served to children, elderly people, or on days when the household needed something softer, warmer, and more comforting than usual. If there was a little butter left in the house, she placed a small piece on top so it would slowly melt into the hot milk. Outside the window, winter was still cold. But on the table, there was still something that made the house feel cared for. Number 18, rice with milk. A bowl of cold rice sat beside a glass bottle of milk, still damp with chill on the outside. On the table was a small jar of sugar used very sparingly. In 1951, in rural Arkansas, rice with milk and a little sugar may have cost only about 5 cents for an entire simple breakfast. The mother scooped the rice into bowls, poured milk over it, and gently stirred so the grains would separate. There was no need to light the stove or use a cast iron skillet like so many other dishes required. For many families, leftover rice was never seen as waste that needed to be thrown away. Cold cereal had older ancestors. Number 17, thin flour, gravy with biscuits. The smell of flour browning in hot grease slowly spread through a small kitchen in Alabama. In 1953, a serving of thin flour gravy with biscuits may have cost only about 6 cents in many poor Southern households. The mother scraped the remaining grease from the skillet, whisked in flour, and then added water or diluted milk into the hot mixture. She simmered it until the gravy began to lightly coat the spoon before pouring it over dry biscuits. There was no meat in this gravy, only the memory of meat left behind in the skillet. But for many working families, that was enough to begin a new day. Did your family ever eat leftover rice with milk, sugar, water, or something similar like that? When people hear the word gravy, many immediately think of something rich and plentiful. But in poor Southern American families, gravy was never a luxury. It was a way to turn the bottom of a skillet into breakfast. For many women back then, a little leftover grease, a few tiny scraps of meat, or a jar of tomatoes stored in the cellar was enough to stretch one more meal for the entire family. Number 16, red-eye gravy with biscuits. The slice of country ham touched the cast iron skillet and let out a sharp sizzle in the still dark southern kitchen. After a few minutes of frying, the brown bits at the bottom of the skillet began to appear around the gently bubbling grease. In 1950, in South Carolina, a serving of red-eye gravy with biscuits may have cost around 9 cents if it was made using leftover ham from the previous meal. The mother lifted the meat from the skillet, then poured black coffee into the hot grease below. Coffee and gravy may sound strange, but that bitterness pulled the salt and meat flavor stuck to the bottom of the skillet into the sauce. When the dark gravy was poured over hot biscuits, what remained at the bottom of the skillet was enough to make the entire biscuit taste like meat. Number 15, tomato gravy. Summer mornings in the Ozarks were often already hot and humid before sunrise. In many southern kitchens, it was also the season when jars of tomatoes preserved from the previous harvest were slowly brought out and used. When the red tomatoes were poured into hot bacon grease, the gentle acidity mixed with black pepper and rich fat to create a flavor very different from the dark brown gravies people usually imagine. During the summer of 1954, a small skillet of tomato gravy may have cost only about 8 cents if the family still had a few jars of tomatoes stored in the cellar. The mother browned flour in the hot grease, then crushed tomatoes into the skillet until the reddish-orange mixture slowly thickened with every stir. In many southern communities, a few jars of tomatoes were sometimes more valuable than meat because they helped stretch meals through difficult seasons. Number 14, grits with ham gravy. Before the sun had risen above the textile mills of Georgia, the pot of grits had already thickened beside the stove. The mother ladled a small scoop of light brown ham gravy over the top before serving breakfast on the table. In 1955, a bowl of grits with ham gravy may have cost around 10 cents in southern mill villages. Just a little gravy was enough to give the entire bowl the flavor of meat and salt for many hours of labor ahead. And this is where the video needs to pause for a second. Modern people often call this leftovers. But to her, it was the most valuable part of the skillet. In factory towns, coal mining communities, and along the farm roads stretching across the American South, breakfast was never something light. People ate to have the strength to stand beside textile machines for hours, to bend over in freezing fields, or to descend into the mines before sunrise. When I look back at these meals, what stands out to me is not only how cheap they were, it is how heavy and filling they were. These were not breakfasts made for photographs. These were breakfasts made to keep a person working through 10-hour days. Number 13, cream dried beef on toast. A jar of salty dried beef sat beside a few slices of bread that had gone slightly stale on the old wooden table. At first glance, the ingredients looked scarce, but with a layer of hot white sauce, they became enough for a long workday ahead. In 1951, in post-war Pennsylvania, creamed dried beef on toast may have cost around 12 cents. The mother sliced the beef very thin, whisked flour with milk in the skillet, then stirred in the meat once the sauce became hot enough. Afterward, she spooned everything over the toast that was still crisp around the edges. Many men returning from the Second World War carried home the habit of eating salty, hot, filling meals from military camps. For many years after the war, this dish continued appearing in working-class kitchens as an extension of those years of hardship. Number 12, buttermilk biscuits with sorghum syrup. Flour-covered hands gently pressed into soft dough on a tabletop worn pale by time. Beside the tray of biscuits, dark sorghum syrup slowly flowed inside a small glass jar like something that had to be used very carefully. In 1952, in rural Missouri, buttermilk biscuits with sorghum syrup may have cost only about 7 cents for a breakfast serving. The mother folded the dough by hand and cut out round biscuits before placing them into the oven. While the biscuits were still hot, rounder syrup over the top so the sweetness slowly spread through the cracked crust. Long before people talked about fermented foods or probiotics, buttermilk already existed in poor kitchens as something completely ordinary. It was cheap, easy to keep, and present in countless Southern breakfasts for generations. Number 11, fried leftover potato cakes. The bowl of cold potatoes from the night before sat beside the stove in the early morning light. To many people, that was food whose time had already passed. But in her kitchen, it was only waiting to be brought back to life in another form. In 1953, on a farm in Iowa, potato cakes made from leftovers may have cost only about 5 cents. The mother mashed the potatoes with a fork, mixed in a little flour and egg, then pressed the mixture into small cakes before frying them in hot bacon grease until both sides turned golden and crisp. The smell of frying potatoes spread through the small room while the outer crust crackled on the cast-iron skillet. Yesterday's food still had work to do today. But America was not fed by Southern dishes alone. Many other poor breakfasts crossed the ocean with immigrants and continued living inside the cold kitchens of the Midwest. Some dishes survived through generations not because they were luxurious, but because people carried them from the old country to America. They crossed the ocean inside the memories of immigrant families and continued living in small kitchens where every dollar had to be carefully counted. For each community, these dishes were not just breakfast. They were a way of holding on to the feeling of home in a land that was colder, more unfamiliar, and more difficult. Number 10, coffee soup. It sounds like something that should not exist. Coffee poured over bread. But for many families in the cold regions of the Midwest, it was the fastest way to have a hot bowl on a winter morning. During the winter of 1950, on farms in Minnesota, a bowl of coffee soup may have cost only about 4 cents. The mother tore stale bread into small pieces and poured hot coffee over the top. If there was still milk or a little cream left in the house, she added some into the bowl before gently stirring it. For many families of Scandinavian descent, this dish was as familiar as the wooden table they gathered around every morning. Stale bread, hot coffee, and a little cream were enough to fight the white cold outside the window. Number 9, fried scrapple. The slice of scrapple gave off a soft sizzling sound on the hot cast-iron skillet, while the outside slowly turned dark brown and crisped little by little. In the autumn of 1955, in Pennsylvania Dutch country, a few slices of scrapple may have cost around 9 cents. After hog butchering season, scraps of meat, liver, and cornmeal were gathered together to create this dish. Today, many people might wrinkle their noses when they hear what scrapple is made from. But for the Pennsylvania Dutch community, it was proof that no part of the animal was wasted. The mother placed each thick slice onto the hot skillet and waited until the bottom became firm enough before carefully turning it over. Number 8, Clabbered milk and cornbread. A jug of slightly sour milk stood beside a piece of cold cornbread on the old wooden table. To modern people, the scene might seem strange, but in many Appalachian kitchens during the early 1950s, it was a completely ordinary breakfast. The mother crumbled the cornbread into a bowl, then spooned clabbered milk over the top so the bread slowly softened in the cool, tangy richness. This was the very dish mentioned at the beginning of the video. Long before probiotics came in expensive capsules or appeared on health food labels, many poor families were already eating fermented dairy in the most natural way possible. Before refrigerators changed every eating habit, many women already knew how to look at milk, smell it, and understand when it was still good enough for breakfast. Did you grow up eating yogurt, clabbered milk, leftover rice, or stale bread like this? Children usually did not remember how much breakfast cost. What stayed in their minds many years later was the sound of the skillet sizzling on the stove, the smell of hot bread just placed on the table, and the excitement of knowing something was being made especially for them. In many poor families, morning happiness sometimes came from only a very small dish. But for the children gathered around the kitchen, those foods could become memories carried through an entire lifetime. Number 7. Egg in a hole. A curious little finger touched the round piece cut from the center of the bread slice lying beside the hot cast-iron skillet. In the middle of the bread, the egg cooked neatly inside the round opening like a tiny surprise game appearing on the breakfast plate. In 1954, in Indiana, an egg in a hole may have cost only about 7 cents. The mother placed the slice of bread onto the softly sizzling grease in the skillet, then cracked the egg into the center opening. Besides it, the small round piece of bread was also fried until golden instead of being thrown away. For children back then, breakfast only needed to look a little different to make the morning feel much happier. Number 6. Bacon grease bread with jam. A summer morning in North Carolina began with the smell of hot bread meeting a layer of lightly sweet berry jam spread across the still warm surface. The mother heated the bread on the skillet, then spread a very thin layer of bacon grease before adding a little homemade jam from a small glass jar sitting in the corner of the kitchen. The salty richness of bacon blended with the sweetness of berries to create something many children remembered long after childhood had passed. In 1952, that meal may have cost only about 5 cents in many rural households. What made this dish special was not how much jam there was. It was the fact that sweet foods rarely appeared in kitchens like those. Number 5. Fried leftover dough. After the main loaf of bread had already been placed into the oven, the mother gathered the remaining bits of dough still sticking to the tabletop into a few final pieces. The children stood close beside the stove, watching her pinch off pieces of dough with her fingertips and stretch them thin before dropping them into the hot grease. A loud sizzle burst out the moment the dough touched the oil. Only seconds later, the dough puffed up and turned golden in the heat. In 1950, in rural Oklahoma, fried leftover dough almost cost nothing extra because it was made from the scraps remaining after bread making. If there was still a little sugar left in the house, she sprinkled a very thin layer across the top before handing the pieces to the children standing nearby with eyes fixed on the skillet. The breakfasts children remembered the longest were sometimes made from the very last scraps left in the kitchen. If you want to try one dish from this list, try the fried leftover dough or the potato cakes. Cheap, simple, and maybe you will understand why children back then remembered them for so long. The final 3 dishes on this list came from things modern kitchens usually throw away. Vegetable broth left at the bottom of the pot, cold grits from the night before, stale biscuits, and grease still clinging to a cast-iron skillet. But in many poor southern kitchens, those very things were once real breakfasts. Number 4. Pot liquor with cornbread. This is the 4th dish mentioned at the beginning of the video. Today, many people pour vegetable cooking liquid down the sink. But in Southern American kitchens, pot liquor was once the part that held the most flavor in the entire pot. The smell of greens slowly cooked with salt and a little smoked meat still lingered in the hot liquid left at the bottom of the pot after the previous evening's supper. The mother carefully saved that liquid and reheated it the next morning. In 1953, in the Mississippi Delta, a bowl of pot liquor with cornbread may have cost only about 3 cents if the cornbread had already been baked earlier. She crumbled cornbread into a deep bowl, then poured the hot liquid over the top so the bread slowly softened and absorbed every bit of salt, greens, and leftover richness. For many Southern families, pot liquor was never leftover water. It was the final part of supper carried into the next morning's breakfast. Number 3. Fried grits with egg. The block of cold grits from the night before was removed from its mold in the early morning light. While cold, it looked pale and firm, shaped into simple square blocks. But once it touched the hot cast-iron skillet, the outside slowly turned golden and gave off a gentle sizzle. In 1955 in Alabama, fried grits with one egg may have cost around 8 cents. The mother sliced the grits into pieces and fried each side until the edges became crisp again. Beside them, she cracked an egg so the yolk would remain soft when the meal reached the table. In a poor kitchen, old food was not always thrown away. Sometimes it was simply given a different shape the next morning. Number 2. Stale biscuits with skillet grease. A cold biscuit was split in half on a scratched wooden table before daylight fully arrived. The inside of the biscuit was dry and crumbly, but still enough to absorb the hot brown grease just reheated in the cast-iron skillet. In 1951, in rural Georgia, stale biscuits with skillet grease may have cost only about 2 cents if the biscuits had been baked the day before. The mother spooned the hot grease over the bread and sprinkled a little black pepper left inside a small spice jar. No meat, no eggs. Just a little warmth, a little richness, and the taste of pepper were enough to begin a new day in the cold fields. Number 1. Pot liquor with biscuits. The smell of greens, salt, and smoked meat slowly rose from the bottom of the old pot, as though the previous evening's supper were still lingering in the kitchen. In 1952, in a farmhouse kitchen somewhere in the Deep South, pot liquor with biscuits may have cost around 4 cents if the biscuits had been baked the day before. The mother lifted the greens from the pot, then saved the hot liquid underneath. She tore the biscuits apart by hand and ladled the liquid over them so the bread could absorb every bit of greens, salt, and the last traces of richness left behind. Modern people may look at that as leftover liquid, but the lesson here is not that people in the past were so poor they had to eat broth from the bottom of a pot. The lesson is that they saw value where others did not. She understood that even at the bottom of the pot, there was still something capable of feeding people. The 25 breakfasts we have just gone through were never born in kitchens of abundance. They appeared in freezing mining towns, southern farmhouses, factory neighborhoods roaring awake before sunrise, and kitchens where every remaining penny always had to be counted carefully. But the most memorable thing about those meals was never simply the poverty. It was the way the women of that time still found a way to place something warm on the table every single morning. The old recipe box was opened at the beginning of this story. Now it can finally be closed again. But its lesson remains somewhere beside the old cast-iron skillet in the kitchens many people believe was forgotten long ago. Many modern people look at these dishes and see only hardship. But sometimes the people who had the least understood best how to care for their families through skill, experience, and quiet patience every single day. They knew to save the grease left in the skillet after supper. They knew which bread could still be softened with hot milk. They knew there was still enough flavor from greens, salt, and a little richness left at the bottom of the pot to feed people for one more morning. She did not cook from abundance. She cooked from memory, thrift, and love. Those kitchens were never perfect. Some winters felt colder because the coal supply was running low. Some weekends felt quieter because wages had not arrived yet. But the next morning there was still something on the table enough to help everyone begin a new day. Maybe your family once had a dish like that too. Something very simple, yet its smell still lives somewhere in your memory. Tell me this. What region are you from? And what poor family dish did your household once have that almost nobody cooks anymore today? I will pin this question beneath the comments section. What poor family dish from your home deserves to be remembered? Those memories may be old, but they still live in the sound of a cast-iron skillet in the morning, in the smell of hot bread, and in the hands that once stood beside the stove caring for an entire family with very little. If these old breakfasts reminded you of someone who once cooked for you, stay a little longer. There are still many forgotten kitchens waiting to be remembered. She did not need much. She only needed a skillet, a little flour, and someone who needed to be fed.